in a forgotten corner of the world, where maps looked like the scribbles of a cartographer with too much mead in his veins and mountains rose as if to boast to the clouds but fell short from sheer exhaustion, there existed a kingdom called Valthorne. It wasn't the stuff of fairy tales, with gleaming castles and princesses singing to birds. Valthorne was a mosaic of ambitions, betrayals, and dust, where nobles wore silks that hid daggers, peasants toiled until their hands bled, and the wind carried rumors faster than storms. In a dusty, noisy village on the edge of this kingdom lived Isadora Valmont, a 19-year-old whose life was about to be ensnared by a fate with a particularly twisted sense of humor. Isadora was no princess, no noble, not even a ballad heroine whom bards would praise in smoky taverns. She was the daughter of a scribe, a man with ink-stained fingers who spent his days copying scrolls with a worn quill, and an herbalist, a woman who knew more about plants than court politics. With chestnut hair always escaping her braids, green eyes that seemed to read anyone's intentions, and a tongue sharper than the village's swords, Isadora was known for her wit, her stubbornness, and an uncanny knack for getting into trouble without even trying. Her life was simple but not dull. She helped her father transcribe contracts for the local lord, a man with more belly than brains, learned to mix tonics with her mother, from fever remedies to poisons they never used but were useful to know, and in her spare time, slipped away to a forest clearing to read adventure novels stolen from the cleric's library, a man who preferred wine to vigilance and whose idea of penance was a nap. Isadora dreamed of exploring the world, of far-off lands where women could decide their futures without a man with a title dictating it. She read about navigators crossing monster-infested seas, explorers defying deserts, and queens ruling without a king by their side. But in Valthorne, dreams were like copper coins, valuable to their owner but useless for changing fate. The women of her village were destined to marry, bear children, and work until their bodies gave out. The luckiest could negotiate a husband who didn't smell of stables, but even that was a luxury. Isadora, who had rejected every suitor in the village, from the butcher's son, who had more teeth than manners, to the blacksmith's apprentice, who mistook poetry for belches, knew her life wouldn't be so simple. But she never imagined fate had something as absurd as a crown in store for her. It was the year 1283, or perhaps 1284. Calendars in Valthorne were a mess, and the monk in charge of dates had a memory as reliable as a hungover hen. The kingdom was ruled by King Eldrin III, a 70-year-old man whose legend was as long as his white beard and as tangled as the laws he drafted after a jug of mead. Eldrin was a crowned enigma, a man who seemed to have lived 3 lives in one. He had survived 2 wars that left the kingdom in ruins, a plague that decimated half the population, and 4 wives, all of whom died in circumstances bards avoided mentioning for fear of the dungeons. Some saw him as a tactical genius, capable of saving thousands of lives with a single treaty. Others, as an old man with more luck than sense, who stumbled into victory more often than he planned it. But all agreed that, despite his age, he had an imposing presence. Gray eyes that seemed to pierce souls, a deep voice that made even the boldest advisors tremble, and an energy that belied rumors of his frailty. Eldrin was no ordinary king. He had ascended the throne as a teenager after his father's death in an ambush that still fueled tavern conspiracies. In his early decades, he had rebuilt a fractured kingdom, uniting rebellious nobles with a mix of promises, threats, and, some said, well-placed bribes. He had signed treaties with neighboring kingdoms, like the belligerent Dracthor to the north and the cunning Illyria to the south, maintaining a fragile but lasting peace. But his reign wasn't without shadows. His 4 wives, a princess from Illyria, a Valthorne noblewoman, a scholar from a monastery, and a mysterious foreigner from unknown lands, had died in circumstances no one dared question aloud. Some called it a curse. Others said Eldrin had a knack for choosing wives with too many enemies. Whatever the truth, his solitude on the throne was as famous as his crown. The trouble with old kings like Eldrin is that they always have one last plan before hanging up the crown, and his was to find a new queen. Not for love. In Valthorne, love in royal marriages was as rare as a vegetarian dragon, but for strategy. The kingdom needed alliances with neighbors who eyed Valthorne like wolves circling a wounded prey. Dracthor demanded ever higher tributes, Illyria schemed to annex southern lands, and a blight withering crops threatened a famine that could shatter the fragile peace. A young wife was the perfect seal for a treaty, a bargaining chip wrapped in velvet and crowned with jewels. The king's advisors, a group of nobles with more greed than sense, scoured Valthorne for candidates. They didn't seek intelligence or charisma, but docility and, if possible, a lineage that wouldn't embarrass the king in foreign courts. But fate, sometimes acting like a jester with its own agenda, decided that Isadora Valmont, the daughter of a titleless, landless scribe, was the ideal choice. It all began with a ridiculous accident, the kind of moment bards would turn into a song if it weren't so humiliating. One afternoon, while Isadora was carrying a stack of scrolls to the local lord's castle, she tripped in a mud puddle and fell flat on her face in front of a visiting courtier. The man, a viscount named Lord Cedric, had more feathers in his hat than neurons in his head and a laugh like a horse with hiccups. He was captivated not by Isadora's clumsiness, but by how, covered in mud, she glared at him and snapped, "If you're going to laugh, at least help me pick up my things, you walking feather." Instead of taking offense, the Viscount saw in her a spirit that could survive the court, or at least entertain it before being devoured by intrigue. Without consulting anyone, he sent a report to the king, describing Isadora as a rustic gem with the fire of a queen. He exaggerated, of course, but in Valthorne, truth was a luxury few could afford. Days later, a royal herald, dressed in so much gold he looked like a walking candelabra, arrived at the Valmont's home. Isadora's parents, who had never seen anyone with such a ridiculous hat, were speechless when the man announced that King Eldrin had chosen their daughter as his future wife. Isadora, who was in the yard mixing a cough tonic with a mortar that had seen better days, let out a laugh so loud it startled the pigeons roosting on the roof. The king? That old man who probably needs a cane to climb the throne? Not in a million years. But the herald, with a tone that blended courtesy and menace, explained that the marriage was not a suggestion but a decree. Refusing it meant dishonor for the family, the loss of their home, and possibly a stay in the royal dungeons, where the rats were kinder than the guards and the food tasted like sawdust. The following days were chaos. Isadora's mother, tears in her eyes, sewed a dress that tried to hide their lack of nobility, using scraps of fabric saved for a special day they never imagined would be like this. Each stitch was a lament, each thread a reminder that her daughter was being torn from her hands. Her father, a man of few words, muttered that kings always complicate things, while sharpening his quill as if it were a sword, as if he could write a letter to change fate. Isadora herself swung between fury and resignation. She knew she had no escape. In Valthorne, women had no say in matters of marriage, especially when the groom was the king. But deep down, a spark of curiosity kept her awake at night. Who was Eldrin, really? Why, at 70, did he need a wife like her, a nobody with no lineage or wealth? And most importantly, what secret could a man who had lived so long and survived so much be hiding? The village, which until then had seen Isadora as the witty girl with an answer for everything, became a hotbed of gossip. Neighbors who once greeted her with smiles now looked at her with a mix of envy and pity. Old women at the market whispered that she was cursed, that no wife of Eldrin's had lived long enough to tell her story. The children, less discreet, made up songs about Isadora, the old king's queen, which they sang until their mothers silenced them with a swat. Even the cleric, who rarely emerged from his drunken stupor, offered a blessing that sounded more like a funeral farewell. Isadora, who never tolerated gossip, responded with her usual sarcasm. "If I'm to be queen, at least give me a castle with fewer rats than this village," she said once, making the few friends who still dared speak to her laugh. The day of departure hit like a hammer. Isadora, in a dress too big for her and hair braided by her mother's trembling hands, climbed into a carriage that looked more like a wooden box with delusions of grandeur. Her parents, standing at the door of their home, bid her farewell with hugs that tried to say what words couldn't. Her mother gave her a small vial of a tonic that will give you strength, even if only in your heart. Her father, with glassy eyes, handed her a blank scroll and a quill. "Write your own story, not the one they want," he said, and those words etched themselves into Isadora's memory like an invisible tattoo. The journey to the castle was long and silent, broken only by the snores of the escort, a man more interested in his beer jug than in protecting her, and the rattle of wheels on cobblestone paths. When they arrived, Isadora was awestruck. Valthorne's castle was a fortress of twisted towers and walls that seemed to defy the sky, with gargoyles that stared at visitors as if they knew their darkest secrets and stained-glass windows that told tales of glory, betrayal, and blood. The gates, carved with scenes of ancient battles, opened with a creak that sounded like a lament. The inner courtyard was filled with scurrying servants, nobles pretending not to stare, and guards who seemed carved from stone. It was majestic and terrifying, like a poem written in midnight ink, and for a moment Isadora felt she didn't belong, that it was all a mistake that would be cleared up with an apology and a trip back home. The court was a circus of intrigue, where smiles were more dangerous than swords and words sharper than daggers. The nobles, in velvet clothes and jewels heavier than their consciences, watched Isadora like an exotic animal brought from distant lands. The ladies whispered behind their fans, critiquing her posture, her accent, her lack of jewels, as if she'd chosen to show up in a patched dress and worn boots. The king's advisors, who saw her as a worthless chess piece, treated her with a mix of condescension and calculation, as if waiting for her to stumble to justify their disdain. Isadora, unused to such attention, responded with quips that left more than one mouth agape. "If my dress offends you, sew a better one," she said at a banquet, causing a baroness to spill wine on her own gown, prompting stifled laughter among the servants. But behind her bravado, there was fear. She was alone in a world where every word could be a dagger and every smile a trap. Her first meeting with Eldrin was disconcerting. Isadora expected a decrepit old man, hunched with age and one foot in the grave, perhaps coughing every other word or leaning on a jeweled cane. But the king, though his face was etched with deep wrinkles and his hair white as snow, moved with an agility that belied rumors of his frailty. His gray eyes seemed to read her soul, as if they knew more about her than she did herself, and his deep, calm voice carried a hint of both authority and weariness, as if he bore the weight of the kingdom in every syllable. He received her in a private chamber, away from the court's prying eyes, decorated with tapestries that seemed to tell stories of a forgotten time and a fire that crackled as if it held secrets of its own. He spoke with a frankness that disarmed her. "I don't want you here any more than you want to be," he said, with a crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But we both have roles to play. If you play yours well, you might find something more than a throne." Isadora didn't know whether to feel relieved or insulted. Eldrin wasn't the monster she'd imagined, but he wasn't a harmless old man eager to pamper her like a lost granddaughter, either. There was something about him, a shadow she couldn't decipher, as if every word was calculated to reveal only what was necessary and conceal everything else. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, she had few encounters with the king. He was busy with state affairs, negotiations with neighboring kingdoms demanding impossible tributes, a rebellion in the northern lands threatening to spread like wildfire, and rumors of a blight withering crops, leaving peasants on the brink of despair. But every time they crossed paths, Eldrin dropped cryptic remarks, as if testing her. "Power isn't in the crown, but in what's kept beneath it," he said once, as they walked through the royal gardens, where the roses seemed more thorny than beautiful and the birds sang as if no one was listening. Isadora, with no patience for riddles, replied, "If secrets are so valuable, I hope yours isn't just a recipe for rheumatism." Eldrin laughed, a dry but genuine laugh, and for a moment, Isadora thought he might not be so terrible. The wedding preparations were torture disguised as luxury. The court ladies, assigned to educate Isadora, subjected her to endless lessons on etiquette, dance, and how to smile without looking like she wanted to stab someone. Their leader was Lady Morgana, a countess with a viper's smile and a talent for insults disguised as compliments. "Dear, your enthusiasm is rustic, but with effort, you might not embarrass the king," she said once, as Isadora tried not to trip in a dress that seemed designed to immobilize her. Isadora, barely restraining her urge to respond with more than words, settled for an exaggerated curtsy that made the maids laugh and Morgana fume. But not all was hostility. One of the maids, a girl named Lila, the same age as Isadora, became her secret ally, passing notes with court gossip and hiding her favorite boots when the ladies insisted she wear impossible heels. The wedding was a spectacle worthy of a bard with too much imagination and an unlimited budget. The castle filled with nobles, ambassadors, and minstrels singing ballads about a love that didn't exist, with rhymes so forced Isadora had to bite her tongue not to correct them aloud. Dressed in a gown heavier than she was, with lace that itched like nettles and a crown that gave her a headache, she walked to the altar with the grace of someone who'd rather be pruning herbs in the forest. Eldrin, at her side, seemed amused by her discomfort, as if he enjoyed watching her struggle not to trip over the train of her dress, which seemed to have a life of its own. When the priest, a man with a voice so monotonous he might have been reading a tax list, declared them husband and wife, the crowd applauded. But Isadora could only think about how to remove the shoes that were destroying her feet and whether anyone would notice if she escaped through the nearest window. Life as queen was a challenge Isadora wasn't prepared for. The court was a nest of vipers, where every favor came with a price and every mistake was an opportunity for enemies. The king's advisors, who saw her as an intruder with no lineage, tried to manipulate her with flattery that sounded like insults and veiled threats disguised as advice. The most dangerous was Lord Varric, a man with a serpent's smile and ambition without limits. Varric, who had hoped the king would choose his own niece as queen, saw Isadora as a personal affront, a peasant who had stolen a throne he believed destined for his family. He sent spies to watch her, bribed ladies-in-waiting to invent rumors, and pressured nobles to demand an heir, knowing Eldrin's age and health made it impossible. The court ladies, led by Lady Morgana, were no less cruel. Jealous of Isadora's position, they hounded her with constant criticism, from how she held a goblet to her preference for comfortable boots over impossible heels. Morgana, with a tongue as sharp as her ambition, spread rumors that Isadora was a witch, a peasant who had bewitched the king with her mother's potions. Though absurd, the rumors found an audience in a court where truth was less interesting than scandal. Isadora, who had grown up dodging taunts from village boys and haggling with cunning merchants, wasn't easily intimidated. She learned to navigate the intrigues, respond with wit, and hold her head high, even when she wanted to send everyone to the devil and return to her forest clearing. "If I'm a witch, at least my spells work better than your hairstyles," she once told Morgana, earning a hateful glare but also the secret respect of the maids, who repeated the quip in the kitchens. Yet what baffled her most was Eldrin. The king was a human puzzle, a mix of calculated coldness and unexpected warmth that left her unsure how to react. On one hand, he was distant, almost cold, as if he saw her more as a temporary ally than a wife, always keeping an invisible barrier between them. Their encounters were formal, limited to banquets, public audiences, and supervised walks in the court, where every word seemed measured to reveal little. On the other, there were moments that caught her off guard, a shared laugh during a dinner when a noble choked on a chicken bone, a comment about a poem they both knew from dusty libraries, a look that seemed to say more than words aloud. Isadora began to suspect the king was hiding something, not just from her, but from everyone. The servants, who always know more than they say, whispered of a secret chamber in the castle, accessible only to Eldrin. Some said it held treasures stolen from conquered kingdoms. Others, evidence of his previous wives' deaths, and the most fanciful claimed it housed a portal to another world. There were also tales of midnight meetings with hooded figures, scrolls Eldrin burned before anyone could read them, and a locked chest so mysterious even his closest advisors avoided mentioning it. Isadora, with a curiosity as great as her sarcasm, couldn't resist the rumors. Each night, as the ladies-in-waiting snored in their chambers and the castle fell into an eerie silence, she wondered what could be so important that a 70-year-old king guarded it so fiercely. One night, unable to sleep and fed up with Lady Morgana's snores, she insisted on sleeping near Isadora's room to protect her, or more likely to spy. Isadora decided to investigate. Armed with courage, a lantern stolen from the kitchens, and a dagger hidden under her dress, because you can never be too careful in a castle full of schemers, she slipped through the castle's corridors. She dodged guards more interested in their dice than their duties, cats that looked at her with disdain as if they knew she was out of place, and drafts that made doors creak as if the castle itself were conspiring. Following a rumor she'd heard from Lila, her loyal maid, she found a hidden door behind a dusty tapestry that smelled of mold and centuries of neglect. The tapestry, embroidered with a chaotic battle scene that looked more like defeat than victory, was so worn the figures seemed like ghosts. With her heart pounding like a drum, she turned the handle and entered a room that felt like a fever dream. The walls were covered in ancient maps, marked with red lines pointing to places absent from any atlas Isadora had seen in the cleric's library. Some maps showed unknown coasts, with names in a language she didn't recognize. Others, drawings of mountains that seemed to shift if you stared too long. There were shelves filled with yellowed scrolls, vials of liquids that glowed under the lantern's light, blue, green, red, like liquid stars, and a desk covered in notes scribbled in shaky handwriting, as if written in haste or fear. At the room's center, on a stone pedestal carved with runes that sent chills down her spine, stood a carved wooden chest, locked with a padlock older than the castle itself. The runes, faintly glowing under the light, reminded Isadora of her mother's stories about ancient wizards, but she dismissed them as fantasy. Magic, if it ever existed, had been banned in Valthorne centuries ago, and those who practiced it were burned without trial. Isadora, feeling a mix of fear and curiosity so intense she could barely breathe, approached the chest. Her hand trembled as she touched the padlock, cold as ice despite the room's warmth. But before she could try to force it, not that she had any idea how, but desperation breeds ideas, a voice stopped her. "I knew you were curious, but not enough to risk your neck." It was Eldrin, standing at the entrance, his expression a mix of amusement and reproach. He wore a simple tunic, without the crown or jewels that made him a king, and for a moment he seemed just a tired man. Isadora, expecting punishment or at least a shout, braced to defend herself, but the king only sighed and closed the door behind him. "If you're going to pry into my secrets, you at least deserve to know why," he said, and for the first time, Isadora saw something in his eyes that wasn't authority or weariness. It was fear, a human fear that disarmed her. Eldrin approached the chest, pulled a key from around his neck, hidden under his tunic, and opened it with a click that echoed in the silent room. Inside, there was no gold or jewels, as Isadora had briefly fantasized, nor evidence of crimes, as rumors suggested. There was a manuscript bound in black leather, its pages so fragile they seemed to crumble at a touch, and a smell that mixed ancient parchment with something Isadora couldn't identify but that made her skin prickle. Eldrin handled it with care, as if it were a wounded child, and sat in a chair that looked as old as he was. "Sit," he said, pointing to another chair that creaked under Isadora's weight. "This will take time." What Eldrin revealed that night changed everything. The manuscript wasn't just a book but a treatise on magic, an art forbidden in Valthorne for centuries, punishable by death for anyone who dared practice it. Written in an ancient language that only a few could decipher, and which Eldrin had secretly studied for decades, it contained a spell capable of restoring the land's fertility, a miracle that could save the kingdom from the looming famine. The blight withering the crops wasn't natural, Eldrin explained, but the result of an ancient curse, a spell cast centuries ago by a wizard betrayed by Valthorne's kings. The manuscript, discovered by Eldrin in the ruins of a forgotten temple, offered a solution, but at an impossible cost. The spell required the life of the one who cast it, a sacrifice that couldn't be avoided. Eldrin, knowing his days were numbered by a hidden illness he kept even from his physicians, had planned to use it himself but needed a queen to rule after his death, someone with the courage and cunning to hold a crumbling kingdom together. Isadora, barely able to process what she heard, felt a mix of disbelief, fury, and something she didn't want to admit, admiration. "You brought me here to be your official widow? That's the most selfish thing I've ever heard," she exclaimed, standing so forcefully she nearly toppled the chair. Eldrin didn't deny it. "I didn't choose you for your lineage, Isadora. I chose you because I saw in you what I never had, the ability to put others before yourself, even when you're furious. And then, with a smile more sad than amused, he added, "Besides, someone has to deal with those useless advisors when I'm gone." For the first time, Isadora saw the king not as a tyrant or an old man, but as a man trapped by his crown, who had borne the kingdom's weight for decades and now sought to leave it in hands that wouldn't falter. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Eldrin began teaching her not only the manuscript's secrets but the art of ruling. How to read the intentions of an ambassador who smiled too much, how to calm an angry crowd with promises that didn't sound empty, how to use sarcasm to disarm an arrogant noble without sparking a rebellion. The lessons weren't formal but conversations held in the secret chamber, by the light of candles that flickered as if they knew time was running out. Eldrin showed her maps detailing the kingdom's defenses, scrolls recording his ancestors' mistakes, and notes he'd written about the court's nobles, with comments so biting Isadora couldn't help but laugh. Lord Varric, ambitious, cunning, but as predictable as a rooster at dawn, one note read. Lady Morgana, venomous, but useful if given enough rope to hang herself. Isadora, who at first participated out of obligation, began to find purpose in the lessons. For the first time, she felt her voice mattered, that her decisions could change the fate of thousands. She learned to decipher the manuscript's ancient language, though the words gave her headaches and the symbols seemed to dance on the page. She learned to negotiate with advisors, using a mix of wit and firmness that left them baffled. And above all, she learned to see Eldrin not as a king, but as a man who had sacrificed everything, his youth, his love, his health, for a kingdom that barely thanked him. But she also knew time was running out. Eldrin grew weaker each day. With a cough he tried to hide and a pallor he couldn't conceal. Rumors of the famine spread like weeds, and peasants began marching to the castle, demanding answers no one had. Meanwhile, the court didn't rest. Lord Varric, suspecting Eldrin was up to something, intensified his intrigues. He sent spies to watch Isadora, bribed ladies-in-waiting to invent rumors, and pressured nobles to demand an heir, knowing it was a topic that put Isadora in an impossible position. During a banquet, Varric raised his goblet and proposed a toast to the king's future heirs, with a smile more like a stab than a gesture of courtesy. Isadora, fed up with his games, responded with an equally sharp smile. To heirs, and to nobles who know when to shut up. The court laughed, but Varric didn't forget the humiliation, and from that day, his plots grew bolder. Isadora also faced more direct threats. One night, a chandelier fell just where she had been standing moments before, during a dance in the Great Hall. No one could prove it wasn't an accident, but Varric's triumphant look told her all she needed to know. Another time, a goblet of wine offered at dinner had a strange smell, and thanks to her mother's teachings, Isadora recognized the scent of a poisonous herb. She set it aside without drinking, feigning a headache, but that night she couldn't sleep, wondering how many enemies she had and how many more would appear. Lila, her maid, became her lifeline, passing notes with warnings and helping her avoid the most obvious traps. "Don't eat anything you haven't seen prepared," she wrote once, and though it sounded paranoid, Isadora knew it could save her life. Despite the intrigues, Isadora and Eldrin developed an odd relationship, a mix of mutual respect and something they didn't dare call friendship. During nights in the secret chamber, deciphering the manuscript, Eldrin shared stories of his youth. Battles won by sheer luck, loves that never survived the crown, mistakes that still haunted his dreams. He spoke of his first wife, the Illyrian princess, who died in a hunting accident he always suspected wasn't accidental. Of his second, a Valthorne noblewoman who betrayed him with an advisor and died in exile. Of the third, a scholar who taught him the ancient language but succumbed to a fever no doctor could cure. And of the fourth, a foreigner who arrived without a name and left without a trace, taking a piece of his heart. Isadora, in turn, spoke of her village, of nights in the forest reading under the stars, of her mother who could cure a fever with a single herb, and of her father, who dreamed of writing a chronicle of the kingdom but never had the courage to publish it. For the first time, Eldrin seemed to listen, not as a king, but as a man. And though she'd never admit it, Isadora began to admire him, not for his power, but for his sacrifice, for his willingness to give his life for a kingdom that barely thanked him. When the time came, Isadora was ready, or so she thought. The famine had reached its breaking point, with entire villages abandoned and roads filled with families seeking non-existent food. The nobles, who had ignored the problem until then, began to fear a rebellion that could topple the castle. Eldrin, barely able to walk without a cane, summoned Isadora to the secret chamber one last time. He gave her the chest's key and a scroll with instructions for the spell. "Don't open it until it's necessary," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And don't cry for me. Kings don't die, they just change burdens." Isadora wanted to protest, but the words caught in her throat. In a secret ceremony, under the light of a full moon that seemed to watch with curiosity, Eldrin spoke the spell. The words, in a language that sounded like a lament, echoed in the chamber, shaking the walls and raising a wind that smelled of damp earth and new life. Isadora, at his side, held the manuscript, with tears she didn't know she was shedding. The ground trembled, the rivers sang, and the withered fields began to turn green, as if the kingdom itself had awakened from a long sleep. But when the dust settled, Eldrin was gone. His body, consumed by the spell, had vanished, leaving only the chest's key and a crown that seemed lighter than it ever had. Isadora, now Queen of Valthorne, sat on the throne with a crown that no longer weighed her down and a kingdom that looked to her with hope and fear. The first days were chaos. The advisors, led by Lord Varric, tried to seize power after Eldrin's death, arguing that a peasant couldn't rule. But Isadora, who had learned more from Eldrin than they imagined, disarmed them one by one. She exiled Varric after finding evidence of his plots in the secret chamber, where Eldrin had documented every betrayal. She won over doubting nobles with promises of fertile lands and a kingdom without hunger, backed by early reports of crops growing again. To the peasants who arrived at the castle with pitchforks and torches, she spoke from the balcony, not as a queen, but as one of them, promising never to forget her roots. "I've eaten the same hard bread as you, and I swear no one in Valthorne will go hungry again," she said, and though the words were simple, their sincerity silenced the crowd. The years that followed were not easy. Isadora ruled with a firm hand and a heart that never forgot its origins. She reformed the court, expelling nobles who lived off bribes and giving peasants a voice in a council she created, an idea that sparked outrage in the castle but applause in the villages. She built schools, using taxes that once filled noble coffers, and ensured women could inherit land, a law that changed thousands of lives but earned her enemies who never stopped plotting. The crops flourished, and Valthorne, once on the brink of collapse, became a prosperous kingdom, known not for its wars but for its justice. But Isadora's reign wasn't without challenges. Neighboring kingdoms, expecting to exploit Eldrin's death, tested her defenses with skirmishes and threats. Isadora, with no military experience, relied on Eldrin's loyal generals but also learned diplomacy, sending ambassadors with treaties that mixed promises and warnings. When Drakthar tried to cross the northern border, Isadora didn't send an army but a message. "If you want war, you'll have it, but first try our wheat." The message, accompanied by carts of grain from the restored fields, was enough to quell Drakthar's ambitions, which turned to trade instead of battle. Illyria, more cunning, tried to destabilize her with spies and rumors, but Isadora, who had learned to smell betrayal from miles away, neutralized them with a network of informants that included servants, merchants, and even bards. In the court, intrigues never ceased. Lady Morgana, who had lost influence after Varric's fall, tried to regain power by seducing young nobles and spreading rumors that Isadora was barren, an accusation meant to weaken her in a kingdom obsessed with succession. Isadora, with no intention of marrying, despite the nobles' insistence, who saw a husband as a way to control her, responded with a masterstroke. She named Lila, her former maid, as her heir, a woman who had proven loyalty and cunning by protecting her in the early years. Lila, now educated in the court but never forgetting her roots, became a respected figure, and Isadora's decision silenced her critics, at least for a time. On lonely nights, when the castle was silent and the servants slept, Isadora returned to the secret chamber. She opened the chest and reread the manuscript, not for its magic, which she no longer needed, but for the notes in the margins, written in Eldrin's trembling hand. They were his memories, his doubts, his hopes, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest secrets aren't those that change the world, but those that change a person. In one note, she found a line that made her smile. "Isadora, if you're reading this, it's because I did something right. Don't let the crown crush you. The kingdom doesn't need a king, but you." And with those words, Isadora closed the chest, extinguished the lantern, and stepped onto the balcony, where the stars reminded her that, though fate had a cruel sense of humor, it sometimes knew how to reward those who didn't give up. Isadora ruled for decades, becoming a legend sung by bards in taverns and recited by children in village squares. She never married, despite proposals from princes, nobles, and even a pirate who swore he loved her more than the sea. She left a legacy that transformed Valthorne into a kingdom where dreams weren't a luxury but a right. When she finally stepped down from the throne, by her own choice and not by death, she did so with the same simplicity with which she arrived. No fanfare, no jewels, just a smile and a quill, ready to write her own story, as her father had always wanted her to. And though historians would debate her life, the king who chose her, and the secret that bound them, one truth remained. Isadora Valmont, the peasant who never wanted a crown, wore it better than anyone, and Eldrin's final secret wasn't just a spell, but faith in a queen who changed the world.